First of all, we want to say good morning to everyone, and we're glad to have you with us. This is another one of our tidbits of history as we move a little further on into the year. And we have a very capable speaker with us this morning who will introduce himself, believe it or not, as he begins. And we want to give him all the time that is allotted to him. His name is Keagan LeJeune. He is author of Always the Underdog. It's very interesting. I hope some of us have read it. If not, your local library has it, or you may also find it. And I know we will get a good taste of some good history. So without anything else, he will give us more. Mr. Keagan LeJeune.
Thank you. Can you hear me back there? Is that okay? Okay. I'm at McNeese. I'm actually in the English department at McNeese. I teach English and folklore. I'm not a historian, but I will talk to you a little bit today about a special type of history called folk history that connects to folklore. You can do the first slide. This information I'm going to talk to you about today is basically the material that I wrote for this book about the outlaw Leatherbreeches Smith and the Grabow War. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for coming very much. Next slide. Part of understanding what I'm going to talk to you about today is understanding a specific region of Louisiana, a region you all know about because it's what many people would say is a region that we live in ourselves, or one that's very close by. It's Louisiana's no man's land, or its official neutral territory. Here we can see the sort of colony of Louisiana that was owned by France. Next slide. When America bought this territory from France, we had an idea of what we were buying, but the boundaries weren't quite clear to us. And you can see this is the sort of original or idea of what both countries could agree on. Next slide. This is actually, when we purchased it, there was a section of Louisiana that we couldn't quite agree on. Spain thought that they had retained the rights, really, quite a lot of Louisiana, maybe all the way up to the Mermentau or even beyond. The United States thought that what they had purchased was territory that extended almost all the way to the Rio Grande. Both countries couldn't agree on what the exact boundary was, so they sent their emissaries. We had General James Wilkinson, who was trying to sort of advance our idea of what our territories was, sort of based out of Natchitoches, and they had a Major Herrera that was amassing troops in Texas to prove their rights. Both men gathered their troops and basically stood on each side of the Sabine and almost came to war. At the very last moment, the leaders of the troops, Wilkinson and Herrera, decided that it would be the best interest of both countries not to go to war over this land, and so they drafted an official neutral territory. They moved all of their troops out of the region, and basically from the Calcasieu River to the Sabine River and about 20 miles, 30 miles west became an official neutral territory. No more settlers were allowed to move in, and all the military troops were moved out. Now, why is that so important? Next slide. I think I have a map of what the sort of region looks like. Why is that so important? Well, you can imagine this official neutral territory suddenly became a place of interest and opportunity for many people. If you go into the region and you talk to people and you ask them about their family's sagas and how their family got to the area, as I've done, I often hear stories about how their family got to the region. And sometimes it's about the neutral zone. Family members are trying to move from Fort Smith, Arkansas, or somewhere in Mississippi and come to a place where they won't be bothered. People in Texas would cross the Sabine River into the neutral zone if they were maybe accused of a crime or running for something. So One thing you have to realize about this region is this moment in history, and it lasted from about 1803 to 1826 when the fort was built, Fort Jessup was built, and they began to patrol the area and sort of move the people out who didn't belong. The official agreement was the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty, that they decided the boundary was actually the Sabine River. But that small period of time in sort of flux created, and what I argue in the book, was a group of people who began to rely on themselves. Without any military there, they were forced to create their own laws, govern themselves, police themselves. So you get a group of people who are used to taking care of themselves. Next slide. The next thing you need to know about the topic happened much later, about the turn of the century, 1900. As you know, this area experienced an economic boom. The timber industry attracted hordes of not only workers coming to work in the sawmills, but also investors. Many people, like John Henry Kirby, bought up huge tracts of land, some of it with financiers from the north, and basically began the process of cutting the virgin cypress and pine timber here and marketing it. This is a good example of how much timber was here in Louisiana. This is the mill in Bogalusa. It was one of the largest mills in the world at the time, and you can see it was owned by the Goodyear family, not people native to Louisiana. Next slide. Now, in contrast to those gigantic mills, and Lake Charles had a few very large mills, there were also many smaller mills, family-owned mills. This is a good example of a local mill. That's small, the Chalkley mill. So the Bell mill, you can see it's a much smaller operation. These local families would own the mill and employ people they knew. It became just like any sort of typical industry. So you have these gigantic mills that employed tons of men, often owned by outsiders or managed by outsiders, and smaller local mills. Next slide. Whether it was a larger mill or a smaller mill, as you can imagine, the work to cut these trees was often not only difficult but quite dangerous. Men would go out into the forest. These are all images from the timber industry near Lake Charles. People would go out into the woods. They would call wood crews, and they would cut these trees, and they had, of course, snakes and insects, but also more dangerous than that were these snag trees that would hang up in the thing and fall on people and hurt them. Next. This is just a picture of some of the sawyers in the woods. So men would go out there, and after someone would go out and survey the land and buy it, the wood crews or the flatheads would go out and cut the trees. Next slide. They were used to sort of, the wood crews would pull with the oxen out of there. They would basically hook onto these logs and then drag them through the woods. Next slide. The scalers would go out and measure basically how much wood was being cut, and men were paid on how much they would produce. Next slide. Later, of course, with the steam power, they would hook these to the tracks, and they pull the logs through the woods through these steam engines, these steam skidders. Next slide. They were loaded up in these spurs. Next slide. Brought to the mills, and again, the men who worked in the mills themselves, cutting the wood and planing it, faced a great deal of many dangers. Next slide. This is from the Library of Congress. You know, even young boys were often employed in mill work, cutting the logs. Next slide. Next slide. After the lumber was cut and planed and dried in the kilns, it was loaded on the trains and then shipped across the country. Next slide. That's a bit of a background of what I'm going to talk to you about today. And so I think one thing you have to realize is the region itself, right? The sort of attitude of taking care of yourselves, of being in a region for a very long period of time, and sort of at least isolated, independent of outsiders. And then suddenly, at the turn of the century, you have this rush of outsiders coming in, buying up tracts of land, creating mills, and many people moving from agricultural work like sharecroppers or subsistent farmers to suddenly becoming workers in these mills. Now the main difference was that if you were a small farmer or if you worked on a farm, the work was difficult, but you got to decide what was going to be done that day. And also, the seasons dictated the kind of work you did, right? You didn't do everything the same thing all year long. When these men began to work for the mills, they experienced not only a culture clash because suddenly a lot of outsiders were coming in, not only mill owners, but the people who wanted to work the mills were coming from Fort Smith and from across Louisiana coming to this region and trying to get jobs. But they also experienced a sort of change in their approach to labor. They now were being told how long to work, what jobs to do, and how much money they were worth by the people who owned the mills. And sometimes those were local families that they trusted, and sometimes they were not local families. Likewise, some people became extremely wealthy by owning these gigantic mills, and some people didn't make much money at all. And so they saw a huge contrast in wealth. While the workers were making very little, the owners of the mills were making a great deal of money. Next slide. What happens, of course, is as the industry increases and the people are making a lot of money, the workers grow dissatisfied. To give you a description of what the working conditions were like here, a lot of people go back to this very important labor leader, Big Bill Haywood. He was connected to the IWW, very famous. He was actually arrested much later in his career. But he came to Louisiana, actually Grabow, to give a report on the working conditions that he found here. Next slide. So what he complained about in this report was that men were treated into something akin to slavery. They were loaded in these cramped cabins or houses. They were very poor condition. You could stick your hands through the walls. The floors were dirt. They would crowd them in these cabins. Next slide. Another practice he hated was that the men, he claimed, were paid in company scrip in all the mills, which meant that the mills would pay you not in cash but in money, fake money, or bat wings or cherry balls that you only could pay at the company commissary. So these mills would, as you know, would have a town where they would have a commissary that sold supplies in the mill office, and men would basically get paid in these things where they could cash them in at the commissary. He also complained that what this does is it creates a sort of servitude. The workers would arrive to the mill and immediately they would have to buy equipment. They might not have money, so the company would give them a loan. Of course, the loan would be of high interest, and they'd have to basically take their boots and their saws and things like that on loan. They would have to pay for fees, doctor fees, insurance, burial fees, and all that stuff would work against the money they were earning. To make things worse, they would pay them in this company script and charge high prices at the commissary. So what happened is the men became sort of slaves of the mill. They owed the mill money before they even started working. So it was a way of keeping people there. Next slide. This doesn't happen at every mill, but for Big Bill Haywood, it happened at more than he thought should occur. And of course, it was national news. They had commissions and all sorts of things, people here trying to determine if that was happening at these mills. Eventually, though, the sawmen in Texas and Louisiana, at about 1906, 1907, go on strike. What they're really arguing for early on is a 10-hour workday and weekly pay. Another thing that they would do sometimes is they would hold off pay until maybe a month, until all the timber was cut, and so they would see how much the men owed versus how much they paid, and things like that. This strike was largely unsuccessful. The strikers and some of didn't really have, they couldn't really agree. There was no real sense of unity. cohesion from one mill to the other. And so this really never worked out. The owners decided to drop the workday till 10 hours, but then in 1907 there was an economic downturn, and to compensate, the mill owners ramped up the hours again to 14 hours. Next slide. So you see some of the desire to go on strike and unionize before this happens, but it's really with A.L. Emerson and W.A. Fussell, when they come to town, you see the formation of the most solid union in the region. It's the Brotherhood of Timber Workers. It's at first not affiliated with any other major union like the IWW or the AFL. It's an independent union only for the timber workers in Texas and Louisiana. And you can imagine what they start to do. They begin to, most of these are from the American press. They basically start to have meetings in Lake Charles trying to generate support. Next slide. What they typically do, they start in Fullerton, they go to these mill towns and they give speeches on the street corner, or they have meetings in a town hall or someplace, and they try to get people to sign up to join the union. Next slide. They really start in Fullerton, and they begin to get people to promise to be part of the Brotherhood. Next slide. This is the oath that the BTW establishes, and they have people sort of swear to. This is about 1910, 1911. In 1911, the BTW goes to Alexandria, and they have their first official meeting. And this is when they sort of establish the oath and get people to sort of pronounce the oath. This is important because you can see that the oath primarily is about brotherhood. It doesn't advocate violence and these sorts of things. It becomes important in the trial that will happen later. Next slide. When they begin to realize that going to these actual street corners and town meetings isn't enough to get enough members, they begin to go to the wood crews, and they try to say, look, will you join the union? Next slide. And eventually, too, they begin to have these large meetings at the mills themselves, right? So you can imagine the BTW begins to be very popular. They gather a great number of men to join the BTW, and they begin to say, we want shorter working days, higher pay, certain living conditions. In response, I think this is my next slide. I talked about that. They're not really aligned with these people later. I should say that in 1912, they had their second meeting in Alexandria, and they decide to align with the IWW, which is considered a really radical union. Many of the people in the Brotherhood don't want to join the IWW or affiliate with the IWW, but they don't have money, and they need money and support from all the different unions across the country. So they joined the IWW in 1912 in Alexandria. And one of the things that's unique about the Brotherhood, and there's a long story about how it happened, but basically what made it very unique was the Brotherhood agreed to have white members and black members in the same union, which is a really radical idea. Next slide. In response, of course, the lumber mill owners begin to say, well, we need to be as organized as the union to counteract what they were doing. I think really led by John Henry Kirby, which was a very wealthy mill owner at that time. Kirbyville, Texas is named after him, and he had many, many mills in Texas and Louisiana. He basically decides that he will form an organization, next slide, to combat them, and he forms the Southern Lumber Operators Association, the SLOA. And their job is to form, just like the union, a cohesive attack plan. They agree to set wages. They agree to shut down mills in a certain region. They basically come up with a very advanced plan to combat the union. They make their workers begin to fill out employment history forms where they have to describe if they belong to a union and what they believe is right or wrong about unions. They also begin to come up with a plan to hire armed guards and even some spies to help counteract what the union was doing. Next slide. But most important, the SLOA was in charge of leading their propaganda campaign. They knew the Union was getting on street corners and giving speeches. They thought they should return the favor. So this is a picture from the McNeese Archives of John Henry Kirby in DeRidder addressing the crowd. He was sort of very famous for not only being a great speaker, but having these large meetings. He would serve barbecue. He would have local workers stand up and give speeches in support of the mills, even people reciting poems about how great the mills were and how good they were to the people. Some people loved John Henry Kirby and supported him and appreciated the sort of economic prosperity that he and other people like him brought to the region. Next slide. Now I think this is very interesting, but there was another group of people who despised him. This is a picture, the same picture, actually printed in the International Socialist Review, and you can see how it's labeled here, if you can see that. It's not John Henry Kirby addressing a crowd, it's A.L. Emerson addressing the crowd of 5,000 Brotherhood of Timber Workers. So you can see, here's a good example of both sides trying to win the public favor. What the SLOA would basically claim was that the Union was seditious and they were outsiders coming in to cause trouble and mess up a system that was working perfectly. And the Union, of course, were saying that the mill owners were, barons trying to rob people blind and not really care for the common everyday man. That was the basic argument. Not very surprising. Things don't change, right? Next slide. Now, in 1912, after a few years of the Union being here and pressing things and the SLOA pressing their side of the issue, Emerson schedules a man named Krill to come down from the north and give a speech. He's supposed to be a fantastic speaker. He's going to come down to Carson and give a speech at a local mill. This is the mill in Carson, a little south of DeRidder. Actually, Krill is ambushed, never makes it to Carson. He claims that the mill owners actually ambushed him and he never makes it here. But basically, Emerson decides he's going to go ahead with the speech anyway, the planned march, and he gets the people at the BTW Hall in DeRidder, and they march to Carson in wagons and things like that, and Emerson's going to deliver the speech that day. When they get to Carson, next slide. When they get to Carson and they pass these logging camps, people know what they're doing. They get to Carson, and the people there begin what they call tin panning. They hit pots and make a bunch of racket, and no one can really hear what Emerson's going to say. The people at people at Carson, you can do next slide, realize that the reception here is so poor, they should travel to Grabow, another small town south of DeRidder, and try to speak at the mill there named the Galloway Mill. Next slide. And this is exactly what they do. They march to Galloway. They get to the Galloway Mill. This is one that looks like Galloway Mill. There's no pictures of it because it actually burns down a year or two later. But they get to the Galloway Mill and they plan for the speech. Emerson and another man named Doc Havens get on wagons and begin to speak. And then suddenly someone in the crowd of Union marchers recognizes a worker at the mill. And he says, his name is Harvard. He says, Harvard, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And he says, well, I'm working. And he says, well, how much are they paying you? And he says, $1.50 a day. And then someone in the Union crowd says, oh, the SOB is scabbing. We should beat him, right? They don't beat Harvard. Someone stops them from beating Harvard. But what is unusual about the meeting at Galloway that hadn't happened before is that someone fires a shot. Next slide. And for 10 or 15 minutes, both sides start to exchange gunfire. This is a rendering of the Grabow War, or the Grabow Massacre, or the Grabow Riot by Gussie Townsley. Different people call it different things. Basically, the mill owner and the mill workers went inside the mill offices and started shooting, and the Union men hid behind wagons or turned over what they had available and fired back. Reports say that the firing lasted about 10 or 15 minutes. 4 men were killed officially, one mill worker and 3 union men. 3 men on site and 1 died later. Now, other people have said that many more other people were killed, but they kept it secret. After about 10 to 15 minutes, the Union men fled into the woods and back to De Ritter. Next slide. And this is a report of the next day. And almost immediately, next slide, the Sheriff Reed, and the coroner, Fisher, heard about the news, took the 10 o'clock train from Lake Charles to De Ritter, and began to find out what was happening. And they began to arrest people. The story goes that as soon as Emerson returned to De Ritter, he called the governor and said that there's a lot of trouble here. You need to bring in the National Guard. So the National Guard, the Company K, came in from Leesville to try to establish the peace, because everyone thought for sure that this was just the first step of the sort of violent chaos that was going to reach across Louisiana in the South. Next slide. Judge Overton, the judge in town that was hearing the case, basically began to send all the sheriff deputies to arrest as many people as they could involved in the crime. This was the actual trial case. The Grabow trial was listed as case 6024. And basically, they just arrested as many people as they heard was going to be involved. They brought them to the jail in Lake Charles, and the first step was to decide who should be issued true bills of indictment, who should be actually accused of what happened. Next slide. So this is a list of the men that were actually arrested or wanted for arrest. You can see here's A.L. Emerson's name here. And then probably, depending on where you go, these are a lot of people's relatives still. Next slide. This is one of the letters on what the strategies. I'll skip that next slide so I can finish. Of course, the SLOA is intensely aware of what's going on here, so they're keeping track of what's happening. And this is a letter from a Slagle that's working at one of the mills in Louisiana, reporting back to the members of the SLOA, telling what is happening. And if you read this, it basically says that, they don't fear anything is going to happen. A bunch of people were arrested, the violence has calmed down, and they're sure that the trial is going to go in their favor. Next slide. What happens is that the true bills of indictment come back where no mill worker or no owner of the mill is issued a true bill, so they're all released, about 6 or 7 of them, and all the union men retain their true bills, so they remain in jail. Over and over again, the Sheriff Reed and his deputies arrest men all summer long. This is July. So they begin to house themselves in the Lake Charles jail. Eventually that becomes so small they move them to the courthouse, the basement. And they sit in jail from July, waiting for trial. Next slide. And of course, it's not only news in Lake Charles, it becomes national news. Many people are interested in this trial. It's one of the biggest union battles in the timber industry, and people still care about it. Next slide. They basically sit in jail because of a summer recess. They sit in jail from July until October before the trial actually begins. Next slide. I should go back a little bit and go back once. And so many people begin to sort of have fundraisers. The people who are supporting the union have fundraisers to sort of feed the men and support them, pay for various things, support their families while they're in prison. Next slide. This is a basic timeline. You can see that the fight happens in July. Here's the grand jury meets. Next slide. And we're already back in October 5th, and we just have the first motion for severance. The trial still hasn't begun. The trial won't begin until the end of July, and the motion for severance is denied. The defense tries a few different things to. They want to try each union man separately. The state rejects that. The Judge Overton rejects that. Right at this time, what is interesting too is that Imperial Calcasieu is splitting at this time. So the men say, well, we should be tried in Beauregard Parish. That is also denied. So they have different strategies. None of them are successful for the defense. And so the trial begins. Next slide. This is one of the benefit suppers they have. Next slide. So basically, I gave away the ending a little bit. So basically, the trial goes on for quite some time, and it's national news. But you can imagine what the basic arguments are for each side. This prosecution is claiming that the Union men went to Grabow armed and dangerous. They were looking to cause trouble. The rumor is that A.O. Emerson stood up on the wagon and said, "We're going to shut this mill down." And one of the mill workers said, "How are you going to do that?" And Emerson said, "By gunfire if we have to." That's basically what one of the stories was. So the idea was that the Union men went to the mill looking for trouble, and they fired the first shot. The defense claims that the Union men were not armed. They went there in peace, and it was the actual armed guards that had been hired by the mill who fired the first shot. And to make things worse, the men were drunk. That the mill owner had been giving the men liquor all day long to prep them up for this fight they knew was happening, because someone actually warned them that the people had spoke at Carson and that they were marching to Grabow that day. The trial is a sort of standstill until Shirley Buxton takes the stand. He says that he is a witness for the prosecution, but he takes the stand and says, well, to be honest, to be truthful, it's actually a person who worked for the mill who fired the first shot. His name was Vincent. And if you look at this, here's his name. And he said, Vincent said that afternoon that he would love to shoot every Union SOB, right? And that later, that they all had been drinking from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, what they call squirrel cider. So that's what his testimony was. It turns out that Vincent was actually the only mill worker who was killed at the riot, so no one was going to be in charge for shooting the first shot. So it worked out. And next slide. Because of that testimony, basically, all the 58 defendants who remained in jail were released. Now that's the history of the Grabow fight and the Grabow trial. And I found a lot of that out by talking to people and doing archival research and looking at history books. But I realized very early on, next slide, that wasn't the whole story. I'm not a historian. I'm a folklorist, which means that I believe there's a truth out there that exists beyond history books and primary sources. There's the truth beyond just newspaper clippings and diaries. What I believe is that you can find out a great deal about what people were doing by looking at charts and graphs, but you can't find out what they felt about what they were doing unless you talk to them. So most of what I do, next slide, is I go out and try to interview people for them to tell me their stories and to see if there is a different truth or another truth buried in the stories. And what I realized was that when I went, this is one of the most famous examples of folklore collecting, the WPA and the FSA efforts to record people during the Great Depression. But what I began to realize was that there was not only these events that happened at the Grabow Mill and the Grabow trial, but this event affected people in the region forever, and they still talk about this issue. Next slide. And what I realized was that most of their discussion couldn't be about actual men who served in the Union or actual men who were in the mills, and they couldn't talk about families who were on one side of the conflict or the other because they still worked with these people and lived with these people. What they began to tell me instead was a legend of an outlaw named Leather Breeches Smith. An outlaw, like all outlaws, that some people hated and some people loved. Some people thought he was a hero and some thought he was a killer. Next slide. So what I began to do is that as I started collecting this legend, I realized that Leather Breeches Smith and his story is the way for many people to talk about the anxiety and the difficulty they experienced during these very stressful times. Leather Breeches roamed this part of the neutral strip. He basically, the legend is that he crossed the Sabine River and he came into Maryville. Different stories have him coming different ways. Some people say he was wanted for a crime and they boxed him in a box and shipped him to Shreveport so he could escape. Some people say that he was just following some family members that he knew. Some people say that he was just a loner. Regardless, he's not from the region. He's not from Maryville. He's an outsider. Next slide. In fact, his name, Leather Breeches, comes from these leather chaps that he wore on his legs. And some person told me that the reason why that was so unusual was because that the people working in the woods in Louisiana didn't wear those leather chaps in the fields because they burned a lot of the woods. They didn't need those things. But in other places, they did wear those sort of leather chaps, like in Texas. That's just a story I heard. But again, the story is incidental. What's important is that he's an outsider, like so many of the mill owners and the union leaders were. Probably the most famous record of the Leather Breeches legend was Ralph Ramis. He wrote articles for the Beaumont Enterprise and wrote a little book. And when I would go interview people, they would tell me about Ralph Ramis, but they always would tell me, hey, this guy wrote a book, next slide. And he interviewed maybe one of the greatest storytellers near Maryville, Goob Newton. He was a well-known hunter and really kind of known for being a storyteller. But people would complain that Ralph Ramis didn't get the whole story. He left some out, especially the part of the story that the Union men would tell. Next slide. The legend goes that Leather Breeches Smith, when he got to Maryville, which was called Hall City at one point, this is an old slide, but when he got to this town and stepped off the train, he almost immediately pulled out his guns and began shooting Purple Martins out of the sky. He had two Colts and a Winchester, and he loved to show off. Next slide. One of the things that he did was he would go into the town theater, sit on the front row with his guns on his lap, and basically intimidate everyone. Right? Next slide. As you can imagine, stories of his incredible skill with a gun are rampant when you hear stories about Leather Breeches. That's almost the first thing they always tell you. He would pull out his rifle and shoot a hawk out of the sky. I interviewed the descendants of these people. This is Ira and Ed Sladen. When I interviewed their descendants, they told me that he hunted with Leather Breeches, and Leather Breeches was an incredible shot. He could shoot a fox squirrel on the run with his pistol. I've never done that, but they say that's very difficult. I don't know. Next slide. He was known to interact with the locals, and some people, as you would imagine, said that he was a horrible, mean man, and some people said that he was a kind, sweet man. One of the stories I heard over and over again was that Leather Breeches would go to your house, pull his pistol out, and shoot a head off of a chicken, right, and toss it to you. Now, for some people said that Leather Breeches would do that to scare you, and some people said that he would do that to show off, what he could do. What I began to realize is that when I heard a story about Leather Breeches doing something like this mean, and I began to ask the person about their family history, their families owned mills or were on the mill owner's side, their descendants. When I heard stories about Leather Breeches being cruel and, a hero and sort of a defender, their families were actually Union men. So you began to see that the whole history and the conflict was made part of the legend. Next story. This is just some more people I interviewed who told me stories about Leather Breeches. I'll talk about maybe one of his stories a little bit later. Next slide. What becomes really interesting, I start to realize when I start to do research, is that Charles Smith, whose alias was Leather Breeches, was not only wanted for his involvement at Grabow, but he was also wanted for highway robbery the very next day. Next slide. This is basically Charles Smith and a few other men had ambushed a sheriff's deputy and stolen what the sheriff's deputy had. Ammunition, rifles, those sorts of things. Next slide. So these are all the indictments about Leather Breeches. Next slide. Some people didn't think he really existed, Charles Smith, Leather Breeches really existed. And so when I found these things, it was true. Next slide. Keep going. What I also realized was that his name was listed on the people wanted for arrest for the Grabow, Charles Smith. But he was the only one not arrested and not made to stand trial. They could never capture him. At least, next slide, they could never capture him alive. What they decided to do, because he was known as a very rough, tough man, was to form a posse. They had a reward of $2,000 for him in Texas. Next slide. And so a group of deputies would constantly go out and search for Leather Breeches. They had a sense of where he was going to stay at night, but Leather Breeches had this incredible ability to know when they were coming or to sleep in a different spot every night in the woods, and he was very difficult to capture. For some reason or the other, one night they find out where he's going to sleep. Some people say that he was betrayed by one of his close friends. Some people say that the people working on the train told them where Leather Breeches was going to camp out because he liked to stay at the pump house near Maryville. Next slide. And so they found where he was going to be that night. Next slide. They formed a posse. This deputy named Charlin formed a posse and ambushed Leather Breeches. Ike Charlin basically told this, Dale Charlin was his name, he basically told this story that he approached Leather Breeches in the morning, asked him to throw down his weapons and surrender, and Leather Breeches refused, and so Charlin had no other choice but to shoot him and kill him. Other people tell a different story. They say that Leather Breeches was basically not nude, but near the river in the morning, unarmed, and he was shot in the back. So you get two different stories about how he was actually killed too. Next slide. But he was killed. They take the body, bring it to Maryville. This is the old jail. Next slide. You can see a better picture of it next. They display the body, put it on ice. They lean against the wall. Story goes that they took a bunch of pictures of Leather Breeches full of bullet holes and his body iced down. I've never found those pictures. I would love. I mean, I've searched over and over for them, but I've never found them. But that's the story. And that they waited. Next slide. On the authorities to come and identify him. You see, they believed Leather Breeches, next slide, was a man from Texas, a wanted man named Ben Myatt. Next slide. He was accused of killing his wife and another man who had basically stolen his cattle. The man's name was Cook. He killed his wife and tortured her for a day and a half before he killed her. And he went to Louisiana. Next slide. It turns out that when the marshal or the ranger comes to Maryville to identify Leather Breeches, he says he's not Ben Myatt. They have different colored eyes. And of course that throws everyone into a tizzy. They can't believe that this happened. They were all positive it was Ben Myatt. Some people think it's a conspiracy because they just don't want to blame this person or give the reward out. Next slide. So the story goes on. They constantly try to think who Leather Breeches is. And even during the trial, because Leather Breeches is killed in September and the trial is continuing, even during the trial, a person comes up with a letter saying that Leather Breeches wrote him a letter. It says, Leather Breeches ain't dead. I seen him about last night. So you can see that very early on, the sort of legend begins to build. Next slide. After he is killed, they decide to bury him in the Maryville Cemetery. Next slide. If you go there, you can see this tombstone. Now, I found out after I talked to a few people that that's not actually where he's buried. They erected that in about 1968. They debate about whether that's true or not, but next slide. It turns out that they actually wanted to bury, they couldn't decide where to bury Leather Breeches. Some people decided he should be in the cemetery, and some people said, no, he should be out the cemetery. So they decided to bury him right on the fence line of the cemetery, which, what I've talked to people, now some people, they know exactly where his original grave was, but it's somewhere over here. I've tried to find it, and I've never really been successful by myself, but plenty of people have pointed it to me. But it was washed out by a creek a long time ago, they said, and the tombstone wasn't there anymore. So, next slide. I found out that that's just a slide about how he fits the typical outlaw storyline. Next slide. Next slide. I found out the historical preservation societies in Maryville and DeRidder began to document what had occurred in about the 60s and 70s. They erected the Grabow riot, and one post, the memorial, the monument, and someone also told me that they put up that tombstone in that spot so that people would not forget the story. Next slide. And next slide. In the 1968, when they have the 150th celebration of the settlement of the parish, they have a gigantic pageant, and one of the things they celebrate, not only a hanging of an outlaw in no man's land, but they also reenact the Leatherbridge's story. So you can go through these next few slides pretty quickly, and what I realized is that even today, they go back to that story of Leatherbridge's again and again, and they recreate these events. And I think the Leatherbridge's becomes a symbol. You know, his story not only follows the pattern of a lot of typical outlaw legends, you know, mysterious background, loved by some, hated by others, a large funeral that a lot of people attend, and so it always manages to live on in some way. You know, he wasn't the real Leatherbridges who was killed, and so on and so forth. And I began to realize that this is a very safe and complex way these people approach history. They tell a story about an outlaw that begins to explain all the tensions and strife that people felt without pointing out who did what and who did what to whom. In fact, when I interviewed people, many people about the story and asked about the day Leatherbridges was ambushed, the Deputy Charlin gathered up a posse of local men who were known to be tough themselves, to go and kill Leatherbridges. They didn't really remember Charlin's name. They knew a deputy did it. They could tell me every man's name in the posse, the local men, but they didn't want me to write it down or record it. They didn't want me to point out the people's families who had done this deed. They didn't think it was right. And that gave me an indication of how Leatherbridges continues to function. You know, I think the Grabow riot and the trial was and the timber industry was a very important shaper in the culture there, but it's still a sensitive issue, you know, something that people want to talk about but have to find the right way to talk about. And what I realized was that you could find out the history of what had happened, but it was difficult for me to find out how people felt about it unless I approached it to the legend of Leatherbridges. So that's my story, and that's really what my book is about that process of hearing the legend and how it connects to history and things like that. Thank you for coming. We're going to have some questions at the end here. Okay. Yeah.
When they went after him, and the ones who went with the deputy, those families, you said they told you the names. Were those family names the ones who were with the mill owners, or were they?
Most of those men were not union men, and only one or two actually were connected to the mill. One man's name was really a sort of a well-known rancher, sort of farmer in the area, and he had a lot of property, and there was a little region where he was sort of the boss of that area. But one man, basically they were workers for the mill. Right?
I recognize a lot of names of families that still live up there.
Yeah.
Like the Slayton, the Dees, Isles.
Right, yeah.
Heard Isles was from that neck of the woods, and they're still there.
Yeah. And I do think they still have that those same sympathies. I showed the picture of the artwork by Gussie Townsley. Her son is actually a lawyer in town, one of her sons. But she told me a story about Leatherbridges going to a family and terrorizing that family, and I found out after talking to her a little bit more that it was actually her relatives that she was talking about, that he had been there. So yeah, I mean, they're all very much still there and connected to the story. There are even a few people who I think claim to be related to Leather Britches Smith. But I don't know if he had any children. I mean, that's a path I didn't travel down.
So he was not brought in as an aid to...
That's a very good question. You know, Leather Britches' role in the Union is a very complicated topic. Some people claim that he was just a straggler who found out about this story and began to sort of defend the working man because he was always for the underdog. That's what one person told me.
Story I always heard,
Yeah.
you know, he just happened to wander from across the river and got into it from Maryville.
Yeah. And some people do claim that he was actually paid by some of the Union, like A.L. Emerson, paid him to come and be muscle for them because there were people being hired by the mill owners to act as muscle. In fact, in the trial, many workers at the mill take the stand, and that's what the defense asks them. Are you a guard? Are you a paid gunman coming in to cause trouble? They actually have spies. Actually, a spy for the mill owners takes the stand during the trial, and he became part of the Brotherhood as a spy. But some people claim that Leather Britches was actually paid to go to the wood crews and encourage them to join. That his job was to ride up to a wood crew, shoot the hawks out of the sky, be really tough, so the wood crews would sort of intimidate them into signing. Now, some people say that, no, he would go there and show them that he had the skill and the ability to stand against these mill owners who had armed guards and who could basically run everything. And that was really, I think, the primary cause of the anxiety. You know, once you get to a closed mill town where the mill owner has a town, builds a commissary, and says everything must be done at the company offices and the mill commissary, and you can't trade with outside people, what they call a closed mill town. They owned and controlled everything. You know, there's a famous writer at the time describing what was going on, and you know, basically it says, you know, that the mill owner was born by the company doctor and taught in the company school and bought stuff at the company commissary, works for the company, you know, offices, dies in the company hospital, is buried by the company grave. You know, the whole thing. It's over and over again.
You know, you take an outsider that came in and put up the money to invest the mill, and the people around there, if any squabble took place, they would automatically be against the outsider that came in.
Yeah.
And that's just life. That's the way it is.
Yeah. Right. I agree with you. I think that's what, to me, is most obvious about the stories. It's that it's not that they loved outlaws. It's that they distrusted outsiders and hated more outsiders telling them what they do and what they could do. Yeah. One man told me a story about Leather Britches, and he said that when they were growing up, they always heard stories about Leather Britches, and he loved Leather Britches. In fact, he would go to the little store near his house, and he would get their butcher paper, their thrown away butcher paper, and he would wrap it around his legs, and not play cowboys and Indians, but play Leather Britches. And they all wanted to be Leather Britches, and they would wear those things around his legs. He's a man in town. And likewise, I get a lot of stories about how Leather Britches was a piece of scum and that he was mean and one of the worst of people. And they would tell me great stories about John Henry Kirby, that he would come to town for Christmas with bags of oranges and give those away to people. And, you know, he wanted what was best for the men working at the mill and wanted to improve them. It's a very interesting history, but, you know, I think if the more you learn about history, you realize that, you know, the journalists and historians are just like regular people. You know, they have an agenda or a bias a lot of times.
In other words, the more you learn, the less you know.
That's right, yeah, that's what I realized right away. You know, and John Henry Kirby had a lot of pull here, you know. He the newspapers reported a lot of what he told them to a lot of times, you know. Not always, but then there were newspapers owned by the unions in the area, so you could get a different side of the story. But you know, I think it was a difficult time for people, and big news, and for Lake Charles too. You know,
Well, that old boy laying there, we call him Booger.
he is a showman. I've seen him at this. Sometimes he's Leather Britches Smith, and then sometimes he dresses up as the Reverend Devil. Have you seen him in that costume? Yeah. John Merle, and he is in all black, and he has a bottle of whiskey all the time, and he's a hoot. Yeah. Have y'all heard this story before of Leather Britches Smith and the Grabow trial? No.
I've heard, you know, a whole lot of things. Because I was in Quincy, and my folks were ran the Whitman Ferry there at Bancroft.
Oh, yeah.
From 1900 to 1920. And they were there when all that was going on. And I've heard all that stuff.
We should go back and see if you recognize your family's name on the list of men who were arrested. Yeah. Well, of course, that's a very popular, you know, your last name is an important name in that region. Your last name is an important name in that region, right? Your last name is Fraser, right, yeah.
My grandpa delivered mail a horseback from Maryville to Bancroft while his children ran the Whitman Ferry.
A lot of the people that come into the library researching, if they're from the Maryville, DeRidder, you know, the area that happened in, yes, they're very aware of it. So people in Lake Charles, or, you know, we have a lot of people in our area that have come in with the refineries from other states. They're not as aware.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another fascinating folklore you might get into. All those money tales that's up and down that river, they're fascinating. Yeah. I've heard a lot of those too.
Those buried treasure stories about, yeah. Do you go out digging for those stories? Some, yeah. I've heard them too, but I've never been out digging for them. Yeah.
In Bancroft, they have one of the hills called Money Ridge.
Wow.
And it's dug all up. You'd think mortars had hit it the way they little potholes.
Well, you know, it's funny because they have, in Lake Charles, they have a place that's sort of known as Money Hill. Yeah. And it's supposed to be where Lafitte buried some of his treasure by the old Sallier house. And people dug there forever until they stopped.
You got another 3 minutes, I'll tell you a quick story.
I do, yeah.
My grandpa put a man across the river from the Texas side, and he bedded him for the night. They, you know, had facilities for that. And the next morning, that man said, "Come with me." And he put his saddlebags under a log, and he pulled out several gold dollars. Now, to substantiate that, he told him the story that he was with Gene Lafitte, and that they had gone up the Rio Grande River and buried the money on the Mexican side and on the bluff. And did you know just a few years ago it was in the paper about where a man and his wife was fishing and found one of those kegs of gold?
Really?
Yes, sir. That was in the American press. So, you know, that's just the way it goes. That's folklore.
Yeah. There's been a few people who have found treasure in Louisiana. Yeah. Yeah.
There's probably a lot of stuff under contract.
Yeah. Right. It's
They
hard to
don't
dig.
trust banks, they probably put their money out in their yard. Died, nobody knows it's there.
That's true. Up here at Vail, there's a big story about that. But it's silver, it's not gold.
Yeah.
I haven't found that either.
Yeah, I hear that story. There was an old silver mine somewhere on the Sabine near there.
Let me finish one more little thing. In the museum up there at Maryville, Well, the people that I was frying the fish for in my story, they were in charge of the festival at the time. And we got down a big mount, and he showed me where there was a silver mine, supposedly, in that area. Well, at the Gator Hole on Bearhead Creek, where, 389 crosses? Old man, Mr. Will Gillum, when he was a young man, found a mold that still had $1 silver in it. Now, I took a device that I have in hunt money, and I went up close to the old ferry, and that thing worked, but I don't know how deep it is. I don't know if it's a mine or if someone hid silver there, and I haven't been back.
Yeah, you know, Gussie Townsley has a painting of that silver, not the silver mine, but a story that her family would tell her about her I think it was her mother or someone was playing with silver dollars on the porch because her grandfather came in, found this mine or some silver, and then lost it.
I was a close friend with Mr. Will Gillen that found that mold, and he was a very reputable person.
Yeah.
I mean, he wouldn't have told that if it wasn't true. And just up above the bridge, just south of the bridge there, where you go from DeQuincy to Fields, is where the Gator Hole is, because one time there was a big alligator in it. So that's where it took place.
I'm not much of a treasure hunter. I'm kind of ticking to go.
We appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I hope you liked it. Thank you.